Every club.
Every day.
The Global Sports Podcast Network.
Ladies, gentlemen, and everybody in between, this is the Daily Newcastle. I'm Michael Grahamslaw, and I am here after Newcastle United suffered their second Champions League defeat of the season at the hands of Marseille in France. For the next 15 minutes, I'll be going through my thoughts on the initial lineup, the game, and where I think it leaves us going into the weekend fixture against Everton. So let's begin at the start. The starting 11, 3 changes for Newcastle United with Nick Voltemada, Joe Linton and Lewis Hall dropping out for Anthony Gordon, Joe Willock and Dan Burn. And I'll be honest, when you look at the lineup, you're immediately hoping and praying it's a 5-3-2 with Tino Livramento as left back and Jacob Murphy as right wing back with Barnes and Gordon as a front two. Because the thought of Mason Greenwood against Dan Burn was absolutely terrifying. And thankfully that's what it was, despite TNT Sports saying it was a 4-3-3 at the start of the game. But the change that I don't think anybody expected was Joe Willock starting the game. I thought Joe Linton was pretty certain to start. If anything, he would have been dropped at the weekend with Ramsey starting at the weekend. But I am glad that Ramsey wasn't the one to start tonight. I think he's a great player. We saw glimpses of that when he did come on. But the physical side of the game that we were expecting to see from Marseille, it's a big risk having an injury-prone player in there. And I think, not to be disrespectful to Joe Willock, but Newcastle United are much more happy to risk Joe Willock at this stage of his career than we are Jacob Ramsey at this stage in his Newcastle career. Personally, I was very happy with the 11 chosen. I was more surprised that only 3 changes were actually chosen out from Eddie Howe. I did think he would either go with a lot more or none at all. I didn't think there'd be much in between, but getting into the game, I think we started the game very strongly. Marseille's captain Balerdi carded for hacking down Joe Willock in like the opening minute. Malik Chow had a header cleared off the line in the first 3 minutes. Newcastle started with the high press and surprised Marseille. It caught me off guard. It caught Marseille off guard. And more importantly, it was the first time we'd seen the high press really away from home in the Champions League from Newcastle. We didn't see it too much against AC Milan, Borussia Dortmund, or really PSG at the Parc des Princes 2 seasons ago, and we hadn't really seen it against Union Saint-Gilloise either. So it was really interesting to see how we started the game, and it was really effective. But I think this was the opposition to do it against. Marseille are the kind of team who, if you put them under pressure, they can create mistakes. And how many times in the first half did Newcastle manage to get in behind, but just not convert the chance? When we did convert the chance, it was an early lead that we took. It was Harvey Barnes once again. He's in great form. Comes from the high press, as I mentioned. Willock finds Tonali. Tonali's on the right-hand side, fires it across goal. Gordon gets a touch, and it falls to Barnes, and Barnes fires across Rooley. What a start it was, but unfortunately, as always, Newcastle United take the lead, and then they sit back. And for the next 15 minutes, I'm thinking, the Jacob Murphy experiment isn't working here. We might need to make changes. Igor Paxao was getting behind him every time he got the ball, and it felt like every time Jacob Murphy got the ball, he was either losing it or slowing play down. And this isn't a fault of Jacob Murphy's. I'll be honest, I can't fault a player against really tough opposition playing out of position. Still had a decent game overall, but definitely not one of his bests. Yeah, for the rest of the game, for the rest of the half, Marseille really dominated. Aubameyang had about 4 efforts in that first half, really. The first is straight Nick Pope. The second forces a much better save. But again, it's one that is relatively close to Nick Pope. Both efforts where Mason Greenwood slides him in behind. And then his third chance, it's a sitter. Aubameyang should have had a hat-trick. Greenwood crosses once again from the right-hand side. The Gabon striker, who, if you hadn't known, played against Heaton Stanton a long time ago. I'm sure that'll go on Sky Sports again at some point. But yeah, Aubameyang heads wide from about 6 yards, and you're thinking, wow, what a let-off. I am really, really glad they've got Aubameyang up front and not someone that's a bit more clinical. Yeah, that goes well for about another 20 minutes. But a big let-off for Newcastle, and later in the half, it gets a bit more close to a 50-50 game. Marseille were having the better of the chances, but Tonali and Anthony Gordon forced Rulli into some decent saves, and the Magpies remained positive on the counter-attack and dangerous throughout. The most important thing, you can sit back as long as you're dangerous on the counter-attack, and that's what Newcastle were. The real standout moments of the second half towards the end were, and it's a lucky moment for Newcastle, really, the sheer stupidity of Marseille teenager Bacola, who does end up getting an assist for a goal in the second half, but he beats Fabian Schär, Schär ends up on the floor after making half a chance. He knows that if he makes contact, the young lad's going to go down. He doesn't make contact. Bacola has a chance one-on-one really with Nick Pope, and he flies to the floor, picking up a yellow card for an embarrassing dive. Can't remember quite when the Olympics is, but whatever it is, he's qualified with that 10 out of 10. It was a real lack of class, really, and it was sheer stupidity that could have cost the French side dearly. He is only 17, though, so, young lads make stupid decisions, let's be honest. But to make matters worse, the first half ends with Marseille keeper Rulli bandaged as he fell to the floor like a sack of potatoes. Belardi's holding Dan Burn. He pushes Dan Burn into Rulli. Rulli falls to the floor. Let's be honest, that felt pretty routine. But he doesn't stop pushing Dan Burn. Burn continues, falls, and the studs go right into the back of Rulli's head. It looked really, really sore. It was a really, really bad one for the Argentine goalkeeper. VAR looked at it and saw exactly what we saw. Not really much fault of Dan Burn there at all. And to be honest, if Rulli doesn't go down like a sack of potatoes under very, very little contact, he doesn't end up getting hurt. So it's kind of karma, really. But long story short, first half, Newcastle looked dangerous. Excellent, really, from us. We looked really dangerous on the counter-attack. And Marseille caused themselves more problems than they caused Newcastle. Now, hold on that line and think about that line while we go into our advert for this particular segment from Bionic.
Your body is unique. And Global Sports Podcast Network has partnered with Bionic, the world's most personalised supplements. Bionic provide 100% tailor-made supplements designed to deliver precisely what your body needs at exactly the right levels to optimise your health. No guessing. So click the link in the show notes. Use the code GSPN2025 for 40% off your first month's subscription. Bionic. Don't settle for off-the-shelf solutions made for just anybody. Get what's right for you right now.
If Marseille caused themselves more problems in the first half, Newcastle caused themselves serious problems in the second. And it began in disastrous fashion with that man again, Nick Pope, making the error that gives Marseille the equaliser. And it does have to be said, it is an excellent finish from Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang. But I do also want to start by saying this begins from Newcastle United's kickoff. The long ball into the corner immediately gives Marseille possession. How many times have we seen that this season? It doesn't work for us. We're not Joe Kinnear in Wimbledon. Let's forget about it because it's becoming really annoying and it isn't benefiting us in the slightest. But this particular instance, Marseille get possession. Bacola puts the ball in behind the fullback. Malik Chow has all the time in the world to edge out Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang. No real danger whatsoever to the Newcastle goal. That is until Nick Pope flies out, completely misses the ball. Aubameyang gets beyond him and, credit to him, curls it beautifully into the net. Great finishing, dreadful goalkeeping. But how many times have we heard that this season? It does have to be said, Newcastle reacted to the goal well for a small period of time. Barnes had a low drive at Rooley, and he also tapped in a chance at the back post, but it does have to be said he's pretty unnecessarily offside. A lot better positioning really should be had from Barnes as the ball comes across. But he's in the position, and he was the only one really from Newcastle that looked dangerous in the final third. And I thought he had a decent game, so credit to him. But it was Marseille that completed the turnaround 5 minutes later. They had the ball on the halfway line, and realistically, there was no pressure being put on from Newcastle whatsoever. Marseille players could have got a manicure, a pedicure, gone for a shower, took the referee's cards, done a marathon, and still had enough time to pass the ball. It really was quite pathetic afterwards, that press. From the high press that managed to get us a brilliant start to the game to absolutely nothing, which leads to Marseille passing the ball around the back. Weah gets it on the right-hand side. He beats Livramento, all ends up, crosses the ball for Aubameyang, who gets ahead of Malik Chow after the ball goes beyond Dan Burn, who realistically should probably be cutting that ball out, but his positioning isn't fantastic. So that is a bit of a problem as well. But Aubameyang gets ahead of Malik Chow and flicks the ball beyond Nick Pope. It's another brilliant finish for a striker that couldn't finish his dinner in the first half. It was absolutely brilliant from the former Arsenal, Chelsea and Barcelona striker. But it is an unacceptable capitulation from Newcastle United. And then we saw Marseille dominate pretty much even more for the next 10 minutes. Højbjerg fired a shot straight at Pope. Marseille were pressing Newcastle higher on the ball, and the Magpies just simply couldn't hand it. Greenwood was the next to fire a shot straight at Pope, but Marseille were carving Newcastle open at will at times. And it led to 3 changes from Newcastle. Lewis Miley, Anthony Elanga and Lewis Hall came on for Fabian Schär. Jacob Murphy and Tino Livramento in Newcastle moved to the traditional 4-3-3. With that change, Marseille were happier for Newcastle have a little bit more on the ball, knowing how dangerous they could be on the counter. However, Newcastle lacked a presence up front, and 10 minutes later, Nick Voltemada was very quickly thrown on to try and save the game for Newcastle alongside Jacob Ramsey, with Gordon and Willock coming off. I will say I thought Joe Willock, while he was the surprising player in the starting lineup, he did have a decent game. He's not really known for his passing, and it wasn't great today. But the effort, the commitment, the running, and a lot, to be honest, the application was there. He had a really decent game. And you might be thinking that is the bare minimum we expect in the Champions League. But to be honest, I actually thought he was definitely better than Bruno Guimaraes today, who I thought had an off game. And to be honest, I thought he was on par with Tonali, who didn't have one of his best games either. But after Bruno and Tonali were absolutely incredible against Manchester City, you can forgive them for having slightly off games a couple of days later. Where credit does have to go to, it has to go to Roberto De Zerbi, who completely changed things at halftime. Marseille started playing shorter passes. This pressed 10 yards higher up the pitch. Their back line was further forward. And Newcastle couldn't deal with it at all. The change in intensity from Marseille just completely put Newcastle on the back foot. But it does have to be said, it could have been very different if it wasn't for the horrific mistake from Nick Pope for the equaliser. Pope's been under a lot of pressure, and I'll be honest, I can't see that easing any time soon, particularly after that error. Newcastle's then began to create some chances. Elanga had a decent effort, really pushed it into the side net, and I thought it hit the post at first, but realistically, it's one where you're expecting Elanga to put it across goal. He tries to go for the near post, and it's a fairly comfortable save for the Argentine goalkeeper. Burn misconnects with a half volley pretty straight afterwards. Tonali fired an abysmal free kick. into the top of the Stade Velodrome. And then Harvey Barnes had a really good chance as well. And to be honest, the XG on it is probably 0.05 or something. But when Harvey Barnes cuts in on that right foot and curls a shot in from long range, you do expect to see it go near the goal, and that's where it was. It was a great effort, really was pretty much stuck where he was. So if it goes in, if it's on target, it goes in, should I say. But when Newcastle start to apply the pressure, we start to see a bit more gamesmanship from Marseille, slowing the clock down, and you really can't blame them for that. Champions League game, under the lights, high pressure for them. I don't like a lot of the players that they have, personality-wise and history-wise, but you can't blame them for how they played today. And it was enough to see Marseille over the line in the end, unfortunately. And it does make it 3 games in a row now that Newcastle have led away from home and lost. So while this is probably the most acceptable defeat out of the lot performance-wise, it still comes as a massive disappointment. And it's also another game where Nick Pope has ultimately cost Newcastle a result. Let us know how you feel about the game. Get in touch with us on our social medias. Reply in the comments of the podcast. And I'll ask the question, does Aaron Ramsdale simply have to come into the side for the fixture against Everton at the weekend after costing Newcastle United another game? He's had some brilliant performances for Newcastle in his career. He's been brilliant for many years, but since the injury, he's just not the same. And I think Ramsdale does have to come in. But also let me know what Newcastle have to do to get a result away from home. Is it one of those where we do have to shut up shop? Or can we go at Everton and try and get a result that way? We'll discuss all of these over the coming days, so let us know your thoughts and we'll mention them on the pod. But this is all for the Daily Newcastle for now. It's another disappointing result for Newcastle on the road. Credit has to go to Marseille, and we'll go again on Sunday.
Every club, every day. The Global Sports Podcast Network.